In the English market town of Royston, in the county of Hertfordshire, during the month of August 1742, a workman needed to secure a new post for a bench in the butter market. The ground beneath his feet was familiar, solid. But as he dug, his tool struck something large and flat. It was a millstone, inexplicably buried just below the surface. Curiosity, or perhaps just the need to clear the obstruction, led the workers to lift it. Beneath it was not soil, but a void. A dark vertical shaft cut straight down into the chalk bedrock. Cut into the sides of the shaft were a series of toe holds, forming a crude ladder descending into the darkness. When a young man, a boy, was lowered down on a rope with a lantern, he found himself not in a natural cavern, but at the top of a cone of packed earth and debris that filled most of a man-made bell-shaped room. It was clear that whatever this space was, it had been deliberately filled in and sealed long ago. The work of clearing the chamber began. Cartload after cartload of earth was hauled up the shaft and taken away. And as the floor of the chamber was slowly revealed, the lantern light began to catch on the walls. They were not smooth. Almost every surface was covered in carvings. Low-relief figures, saints, crosses and symbols that were immediately recognisable as medieval in character. St. Catherine with her wheel, St. Christopher carrying the Christ-child, a depiction of the crucifixion. Here was a substantial piece of physical evidence, an entire subterranean room, decorated with purpose and skill, located directly beneath a public square. Yet when the townspeople and local antiquarians searched the records, the land deeds, the church archives, the town chronicles, they found nothing. No mention of its construction, no record of its use, no account of its ceiling. The room was physically present, but in the written memory of the town it was completely silent. This is the central problem of Royston Cave, and it is the question that begins our own inquiry. What does it mean when a place survives in stone, but not in words? Over the centuries, many explanations have been proposed. One of the most persistent is that the cave was a secret chapel or meeting place for the Knights Templar, the powerful military order suppressed in the early 14th century. The iconography, some argue, has parallels to Templar sites. The secrecy of the location fits their narrative as a persecuted group. This is an interpretation. It is a compelling story, but it is not at present a proven fact. The official national heritage body, Historic England, notes that while the carvings are medieval, their specific inspiration, whether Templar or from some other religious or private devotional practice, remains debated. The purpose of the chamber is listed as unresolved. The documentary silence holds. So we begin not with a solution, but with a clearer statement of the problem, a room full of marks but with no surviving key. This single chamber in the Hertfordshire chalk poses the question we will follow across Britain. What can the ground tell us when the archives are quiet, and how do we listen to its story without inventing one of our own? The single chamber at Royston raises a question. If a space can be so carefully made, yet so poorly recorded, where does the habit of working underground begin? To find a firmer starting point, we must leave the market town and travel northeast to a quiet landscape in the county of Norfolk. Here, the ground is not smooth. It is a strange, unsettled heathland, covered in shallow circular depressions like faint scars on the earth. This is Grime's Graves, and unlike Royston Cave, we have a clear evidence-based answer for what it is. This is a vast industrial site. It is a flint mining complex operated by Neolithic people around 2650 BCE. The scale of the operation is difficult to comprehend from the surface. Those shallow dips in the ground are the remains of more than 430 mine shafts, dug by hand with tools made of bone, wood, and antler. For generations, people came to this specific place for a specific reason. They were not building a private chapel or a hidden meeting place. They were extracting a vital resource. Below the soil and sand there is a deep layer of chalk, and within that chalk there are seams of high-quality black flint. For a Neolithic community, this flint was the raw material for technology. It was the foundation for axes, knives, scrapers, and arrowheads. To get the best material, the floorstone flint, which had not been cracked by frost, they had to go deep. This is the first and most important contrast with the chamber at Royston. At Grime's Graves, the purpose is not a matter of iconographic debate. It is a matter of geology and labour. The evidence is not confined to one sealed room. It is spread across hundreds of shafts and the debris of millions of worked flint pieces. Here, the documentary silence of the Neolithic period is normal. The story is not written in texts, but in the marks left by tools on chalk walls and in the sheer scope of the landscape itself. This is known ground. It does not prove a lost civilization or a forgotten technology. It proves something more grounded and perhaps more impressive, that thousands of years ago communities in Britain possessed the geological knowledge, the social organisation, and the physical determination to undertake massive engineering projects. They knew where to dig, how to dig, and why it was worth the effort. The mystery here is not what they were doing, but how we so often underestimate the skill of prehistoric people. From the surface, it is an abstract pattern of hollows, but more than 30 of these shafts have been archaeologically investigated. One of them, known as Pit Number 1, is open. It allows for a 9-metre descent down into the world the miners made. To stand at the base of Pit Number 1 is to be inside the work. The 9-metre descent leaves the Norfolk sky behind and the air cools. The walls are not natural cavern stone. They are cut chalk, bearing the marks of the tools that made them. This is not a space that was found. It is a space that was willed into being for a single, overriding purpose. From the bottom of the shaft, the real work began. The miners did not dig randomly. They had descended to a specific geological horizon, a layer of high-quality black flint known as floor stone. To extract it, they cut a series of low, narrow passages outwards from the base of the shaft. These are the radiating galleries. They look like the spokes of a wheel, each one following the precious seam until it was exhausted. The miners would work in cramped conditions, likely on their backs or knees, using picks made from red deer antlers to prise the flint nodules from the surrounding chalk. The marks of those antler tines are still visible in some places, scratches in the soft white rock, preserved for more than 4,000 years. The scale of this operation is difficult to absorb. Each of the more than 400 shafts was a major undertaking, and archaeological investigation suggests that not all shafts were open at once. It appears to have been a continuous generational effort. A community, or perhaps several communities, returned to this one pockmarked field for centuries, carrying the knowledge of how to sink a safe shaft, how to read the chalk for signs of flint, and how to work in the dark. Flint was the essential material of the later Neolithic period. It was the foundation of technology. A sharp flint axe could clear woodland for farming. A flint knife could butcher an animal. Flint arrowheads could hunt. Control of a source like this was control of a fundamental resource. The labour was immense, but the reward was survival and perhaps prosperity. Here, the silence is different from the silence at Royston Cave. The physical evidence at Grime's graves provides a clear, logical story of process. We can see the problem, reaching the flint, and the solution, the shaft and gallery. The mystery is not what they were doing, or why. The documentary silence here is about the individuals. We do not have their names, their language, or their beliefs, but we have their work. We have the clear, undeniable signature of organised human effort. And this clarity provides a crucial baseline. It shows what a large-scale, practical underground project from deep history looks like. Which brings us to a different, more complicated kind of structure. What happens when we find ancient passages, just as skillfully built, but without the obvious practical purpose of a flint seam at the end of them? The industrial logic of Grime's graves is clear. The shafts descend to the floor stone, and the galleries follow the flint. The purpose is written in the geology itself, but not every ancient underground passage offers such a direct explanation. The human impulse to dig can be driven by needs other than extraction, and these needs often leave behind more ambiguous structures. We move from the chalk of Norfolk to the granite country of Cornwall, and from the Neolithic to the Iron Age. Here, within the remains of an ancient farming settlement, is an entrance into the ground that poses a different kind of question. It is called Halliggye Fogou. The name itself is a clue. Fogou is a word from the Old Cornish language, related to a word for cave. These are not natural formations. A fogou is a man-made underground stone-lined passage. Halliggye is among the largest and best preserved. It was likely built sometime in the 5th or 4th century BCE. The structure is a series of passages, built with massive stone slabs for walls and heavy capstones for a roof, all covered by earth. The labour involved was significant. This was not a casual undertaking. It was a central feature of the community that lived on the surface above. But what was it for? This is where the clear evidence of form meets the silence of function. Unlike the flint mines, there is no single, obvious product being extracted. So, we must use the evidence ladder starting with what is known. The structure is ancient, carefully built, and integrated into a domestic settlement. From there, several interpretations emerge, and none has achieved complete consensus. The first possibility is storage. The cool, dark, stable environment inside a fogou would have been ideal for preserving food such as grain or dairy products, away from the variable weather on the surface. This is a practical, logical reading that accounts for its location within a farmstead. The second possibility is refuge. In a time of raids or local conflict, the narrow passages could have served as a temporary, defensible hiding place for people or their most valuable possessions. Some fogous have features that seem to support this, like constricted entrances that would be difficult to force. A third interpretation looks at the immense effort of construction and the profound darkness of the interior, and suggests a ritual or ceremonial function. Perhaps it was a place for initiations, for consulting spirits, or for ceremonies connected to the earth and the ancestors. The act of entering such a space could have been deeply symbolic, separating an individual from the world of light and daily life. English heritage, which cares for the site, acknowledges all these possibilities: storage, shelter, or shrine. The truth may be a combination that our modern categories struggle to hold at once. It could have been a storage space that was also spiritually significant, or a refuge whose protective power was partly magical. What remains certain is the object itself, a long, low, quiet passage of stone. Holding a question that has outlasted its builders by more than 2,000 years. The structure at Halliggye is not an isolated puzzle. It belongs to a wider family of ancient underground constructions found across Britain and Ireland. As we move from Cornwall into eastern Scotland, the local name changes, but the core question remains. Here they are called souterrains, a term from French, simply meaning underground, or sometimes earth houses. Like the fogous, a souterrain is typically a stone-lined passage, built below ground level and associated with an Iron Age settlement. They are often long, narrow and low-roofed, curving as they follow the contours of the earth. But the label Earth House can be misleading. A key finding from Historic Environment Scotland, the agency that cares for these sites, is that souterrains were not dwellings. The conditions are consistently damp, dark, and poorly ventilated. They were not built for people to live in. So the question deepens: if not for living, then what were they for? The physical evidence allows for several competing interpretations, and archaeologists have debated them for decades. The most straightforward reading is practical: storage. The cool, stable temperature would have been ideal for preserving foodstuffs like grain or dairy products. In a world without refrigeration, a structure like this could have been a vital household asset. Another practical theory is security. The narrow passages could be a place to hide valuable goods, or even serve as a temporary refuge for people during a raid, although their limited space and lack of easy escape routes make this a risky proposition. But practical uses may not tell the whole story. The sheer amount of labour required to build one, quarrying massive stones, digging deep trenches, roofing the passage, seems disproportionate for a simple cellar. This has led some researchers to suggest a social function. Perhaps building a souterrain was a display of a family's status and power within the community. And finally, there is the possibility of ritual. We have very little direct evidence for Iron Age belief systems, but the act of entering the earth, of moving through a dark, stone-lined space, carries powerful symbolic weight in many cultures. It's possible these passages were used for ceremonies, rites of passage, or other activities that connected the community to the earth itself. The challenge is that these explanations are not mutually exclusive. A souterrain could have been a storehouse that also conferred status, and was occasionally used for household rituals. The modern mind often seeks a single, clean label. It was a pantry, a bunker, or a temple. But for the people who built them sometime between the last centuries before the Common Era and the first 2 centuries of the Common Era, these functions may not have been separate at all. This pattern, of a physically impressive structure whose purpose remains open to careful debate, is common in the deep past. But it is not the only kind of underground history. To understand the ambiguity of the Iron Age, It helps to contrast it with a time when the records are clearer. We now move forward more than 1,000 years, to the medieval period, and to a city with an extensive network of underground passages whose purpose is known beyond any doubt. From the low-roofed stone passages of the Iron Age, where purpose remains a field of careful debate, we can move south to the county of Devon and the city of Exeter. Beneath its streets lies another network of human-sized tunnels. They are vaulted with dressed stone, and a person can walk through them for long distances. At first glance they might seem to fit the pattern of unexplained voids, but here the central question shifts. For these passages there is no deep documentary silence. Their function is known, recorded, and serves as a vital point of contrast. The Exeter underground passages were constructed in the 13th century for a single clear purpose: to bring clean water into the medieval city. Springs were located outside the city walls, and the water was carried through a series of lead pipes. Lead pipes, then as now, can leak and require repair. The engineers faced a choice. They could bury the pipes and dig up the city streets every time a fault occurred, or they could build something more permanent. They chose the latter. These vaulted stone passages are not destinations in themselves. They are maintenance conduits, built around the pipes to give workers access for repairs. This is not a space for ritual or refuge. It is a piece of sophisticated civic infrastructure. The mystery it solves is not one of ancient belief, but of logistics. The elegance of the solution is its own quiet story. It tells of a community that valued both clean water and undisturbed streets enough to invest in a long-term underground solution. The passages are a record of maintenance, of foresight, of a city managing its own health and function. They provide a necessary baseline. Before we can assess a claim of mystery, we must first ask if a practical, documented explanation already exists. Exeter reminds us that a human-sized tunnel can be for a human-sized task, which raises a different and perhaps more persistent question. If the reason for passages like these is so clearly recorded, why does the folklore of secret tunnels, of monks and smugglers and hidden escapes, remain so powerful in so many other places? The passages beneath Exeter show us a documented reality. A clear purpose, delivering water, drove the construction of a human-sized underground network in the 13th century. But this kind of clarity is rare. There is another category of underground story, one that is far more common in local memory across Britain, and far less visible in the archaeological record. It is a story that almost every old town with an abbey or monastery seems to tell. It describes a secret tunnel, often running for a mile or more, connecting the religious house to a nearby castle, a distant barn, or, most frequently, a local inn. These are the monk tunnels of folklore. The stories are a form of evidence in themselves. They tell us about a persistent shared curiosity about what the medieval church did in private. The narrative is often one of transgression, of monks sneaking out for reasons the official histories would not record. But when we move from the story to the physical world, the claim meets serious obstacles. The engineering required to build a tunnel a mile long through medieval earth and rock would have been a monumental undertaking. A project on that scale presents a series of difficult practical questions. How would the builders have supplied fresh air to workers deep underground? Without ventilation shafts, the air would become unbreathable in a short distance. How would they have dealt with groundwater or the risk of collapse? And perhaps most simply, where did all the excavated soil go? A tunnel of that length produces an immense volume of spoil, and its disposal would be difficult to hide. This is not to say that no secret passages ever existed. What the engineering challenges suggest is that the long-distance Abbey-to-Inn version of the story is unlikely to be literally true. The more cautious reading of the evidence points to a different origin for the folklore. Many of these stories likely began with a real but much shorter and more practical underground feature. A large stone-lined drain, built to carry waste away from a monastery, could easily be remembered centuries later as a secret passage. An extensive cellar or undercroft used for storage might have a blocked-up entrance that fuels speculation. A short, defensive tunnel, a postern, designed to allow people to leave a fortified site under siege, is a documented reality of medieval architecture. It is easy to see how the memory of a 100-foot escape route could, through generations of retelling, stretch into a passage running for 1,000 feet and then a mile. A real void in the ground often inspires a story to fill it. The folklore of the monk's tunnel may not describe a physical reality, but it preserves a genuine sense of curiosity about the hidden life of powerful institutions. The story survives, even when the tunnel itself does not, because it is a better story than that of a medieval drain. But this pattern of a practical origin being forgotten and replaced by legend is not limited to folklore. Sometimes, the shape of the ground itself can be the source of the misunderstanding. The folklore of secret monk tunnels often grows from a real, but much shorter, physical feature: a cellar, a culvert, a drain. The story outgrows the space, but there is another category of underground void where the structure itself is so specific, so unusual, that it seems to demand a dramatic explanation. These are often found as unexpected depressions in fields, particularly in the chalk landscapes of southern and eastern England, in counties like Kent and Essex. From the surface, it is just a hole, but if one could see a cross-section, the shape would be precise: a narrow vertical shaft, sometimes descending 10, 20, or even 30 metres, which then opens out at the bottom into a series of symmetrical chambers, radiating from the central point like the petals of a flower. The folk name for such a structure is a denehole. For a long time, the name itself seemed to offer a clue. It was popularly interpreted as a Dane hole, a hiding place from Viking raiders, or perhaps a store for their plunder. Other theories suggested they were ancient grain silos or even ritual chambers. The unusual shape seemed too deliberate for a simple pit. But the explanation, according to the British Geological Survey and extensive fieldwork, is a quiet story of forgotten labour. The key is in the geology. These pits were dug to extract clean, uncontaminated chalk from beneath the topsoil and less pure upper layers. This chalk was valuable, in powdered form, it was spread on acidic clay farmland, a process called marling, to improve the soil's fertility. It was also a critical component for making lime mortar, essential for building. The strange shape of the denehole was not for ritual or for hiding. It was an ingenious solution to an engineering problem. The diggers wanted to access the best chalk with the least amount of effort and, most importantly, without sacrificing valuable agricultural land on the surface. A wide, open quarry would have destroyed a large area of a field. A narrow shaft, just wide enough for a person and a bucket, took up minimal space. Once the shaft reached the desired chalk seam, the workers would excavate sideways, carving out the radiating chambers to maximize the amount of high-quality chalk they could extract from a single shaft. The work itself would have been difficult and dangerous. A person would be lowered down the dark shaft, digging out the chalk in cramped, unlit chambers, which would then be hauled to the surface. When one seam was exhausted, the shaft would be abandoned, sometimes loosely covered, sometimes left to fill in naturally over centuries, and here the mechanism of forgetting takes over. Generations later, the local memory of marling and small-scale chalk extraction faded. The practical reason for these deep, strangely shaped shafts was lost. But the physical voids remained. A farmer ploughing a field might suddenly break through into one. A new story would be needed to explain the deep, dark shaft with its hidden rooms. The story of forgotten agricultural work was replaced by a more exciting one, of invaders, hidden treasure, or ancient rites. The denehole shows how a perfectly logical structure, born of ordinary need, can become a mystery when the memory of the work that made it is lost. This process of practical labour being overwritten by legend happened with individual shafts in rural fields. But what happens when the underground spaces are not isolated pits, but a vast network beneath an entire city? The narrow chalk shafts of the deneholes were a rural solution to a specific need. They followed a seam of valuable material deep underground, leaving the surface fields above as undisturbed as possible. But what happens when the ground itself is the resource? When the bedrock beneath an entire city is not a barrier to be pierced, but a medium to be carved? We move now to the city of Nottingham. Here the geology is different. The ground is a Triassic deposit known as bunter sandstone. It is a material with a unique combination of properties. It is soft enough to be dug and shaped with relative ease, using simple hand tools. Yet, once exposed to the air, its surface hardens, giving it a surprising structural integrity. It is stable enough to hold the shape of a room, a tunnel, or a cellar for centuries. This geological opportunity was not missed. For generations, the people of Nottingham did not only build upon the ground, they built down into it. The result is not a single tunnel system, or a handful of forgotten cellars, it is a documented subterranean landscape of remarkable scale. According to the Nottingham City Council, which manages this heritage as a formal planning consideration, there are more than 900 known caves carved into the sandstone beneath the city. This number, more than 900, requires careful consideration. It does not describe a unified, interconnected labyrinth. It is not evidence of a single secret project. It is instead an inventory, a catalogue of human activity, accumulated over 1,000 years. Each cave was created for a specific purpose, at a specific time. By individuals or small groups responding to the needs of the day, this creates a kind of vertical memory for the city. Beneath the modern roads, the shops and the houses lies a cross-section of Nottingham's past. A void that was once a medieval tannery, its pits still visible, exists below a Victorian storefront. A pub's beer cellar extends far deeper than modern regulations would require, because it was originally a 17th century dwelling. Passages carved out for industrial storage during the city's manufacturing peak were later repurposed by families as air raid shelters during the Second World War. Unlike the passages at Exeter, which served one primary civic function, the Nottingham Caves represent nearly every facet of urban life. They were homes, workshops, storehouses, and places of refuge. This vast, diffuse network of spaces complicates our central question. At Grime's graves, the purpose was clear: flint extraction. At Halliggye, the purpose is debated but likely singular to its community. In Nottingham, the purpose is plural. The mystery is not who built it, but rather, how does a city live with and eventually forget so much of itself just a few feet beneath the surface? The stone survives, but the connection to the daily lives lived within it has become a matter for archaeology and careful record-keeping. The geology beneath Nottingham offered a unique resource. The soft bunter sandstone is not just a foundation, it is a workable material. For centuries, the answer to needing more space was not always to build up, but to dig down. This is where the sheer number of caves begins to resolve into a human story. A story not of a single grand design, but of continuous small-scale adaptation. A space might begin its life in the Middle Ages as a simple cellar, dug out to store ale at a stable, cool temperature for a tavern above. The sandstone, once removed, could be sold or used as building material. A century later, as the city's industries grew, that same cellar might be expanded. New chambers could be cut to create a tannery, a place where the noxious processes of curing leather could be kept away from the streets. Records and archaeological work confirm a landscape of underground workshops, maltings, breweries and potteries, all found a home in the stable environment of the caves. This process is one of repurposing. A space is rarely frozen with its original identity. As the city changes, the voids beneath it are re-evaluated and given new work to do. A medieval maltings, once obsolete, does not simply vanish. It might be bricked up, partially filled, or absorbed into the foundation of a new building, its entrance now a cellar door in a Victorian-era factory. Later still, during the Second World War, that same forgotten industrial space could be cleared out and reinforced, becoming an air raid shelter for the factory's workers. Each layer of use adds to the complexity of the record, and often obscures the layer that came before. The caves were not only for industry, they were also for a time homes. Descriptions from the 17th and 18th centuries speak of rock-hewn dwellings, some of them forming entire subterranean communities. This was not a romantic choice, but an economic one. Carving a room from sandstone was often cheaper and faster than building with expensive timber or brick. These spaces represent a form of vernacular architecture that is almost entirely absent from the surface world. They tell a story of the city's poorest residents, whose lives were lived in the literal foundations of the more visible Nottingham. A city can have a vertical memory, with the lives of ordinary people preserved not in grand monuments, but in the tool marks on a sandstone wall deep beneath the modern pavement. The sandstone beneath Nottingham shows how an entire city can live on top of its own vertical memory, with hundreds of rooms serving the changing needs of daily life. But what happens when an underground space is not just repurposed, but also reimagined, accumulating so many layers of story that the original purpose becomes difficult to see? For this, we can look at the man-made passages at Chislehurst, historically in Kent, and now part of Greater London. Here, a vast network of corridors, reportedly over 20 miles in total length, has been carved out of the chalk. The physical evidence points to a clear industrial origin. These are mines, excavated over a long period to extract both chalk and flint. The tool marks on the walls are the residue of labour, not ritual. Then, in the 20th century, this industrial void was repurposed on a national scale. During the First World War, part of the network was used as a munitions depot for the Woolwich Arsenal, a secure underground warehouse for the materials of conflict. 2 decades later, during the Second World War, the caves were repurposed again, this time for human survival. They became one of the largest deep air raid shelters in the country, a subterranean city that at its peak housed up to 15,000 people. It had electric lighting, a chapel and a hospital, a fully managed community existing below ground to escape the dangers on the surface. These uses are documented. They are part of the site's verifiable history. This is where the evidence ladder becomes essential. The story presented to visitors today reaches much further back in time. The passages are organised into 3 main sections, named for their supposed origins: Druid, Roman and Saxon. This is a powerful part of the site's modern identity, but it must be handled with care. This naming convention appears to be a feature of its life as a tourist attraction, a way to organise a vast space for visitors. It is not, however, a settled archaeological conclusion. The evidence for these specific ancient uses, particularly for a continuous occupation by these distinct groups, is not as robust as the evidence for its industrial and wartime history. Chislehurst therefore shows us a more complex kind of layering. A space is created for extraction. It is later adapted for military logistics. It is then transformed into a site of mass civilian shelter. Finally, it is reframed as a journey into a deeper, more romantic past. The physical chalk passages are the constant, but the meaning projected onto them changes with each new generation of use. The story itself has been repurposed, just like the space. This process, where a practical space accumulates stories, is common, but some underground excavations were never primarily for work, or storage, or shelter. They were created from the beginning as a kind of theatre. The spaces we have examined so far were often born from necessity. Flint for tools, water for a city, chalk for the fields, shelter from the elements. Even at Chislehurst, the motive began with extraction. But not all underground spaces are shaped by practical need. Some are shaped by desire. In the county of Buckinghamshire, near the village of West Wickham, a man-made opening leads into the chalk of a prominent hill. This is not the narrow, functional shaft of a denehole, nor the collapsed mouth of a forgotten mine. It is a formal entrance, an invitation. These are the Hellfire Caves, and here, the nature of our investigation changes. We are not dealing with documentary silence. The record is quite clear. The caves were excavated in the 1740s under the direction of a known individual, Sir Francis Dashwood, an aristocrat, politician and founder of several exclusive social clubs. This documented origin presents a different kind of question. If the purpose was not industrial, not civic, and not for simple shelter, then what was it for? The evidence of the caves themselves suggests they were designed as a stage. A sequence of chambers and passages cut from chalk and flint creates a route, a procession. The excavation itself may have served as a local employment project, but its ultimate purpose was not the material removed. It was the void that remained. Here, we must step carefully onto the evidence ladder. What is directly evidenced is the excavation by Dashwood, a man known for his interest in classical antiquity, art, and exclusive societies. What is a cautious reading of the physical space is that it was created for a theatrical or social experience, a journey into a separate world for his guests. What remains unresolved are the precise activities that took place inside. This is where history becomes entangled with folklore and political satire. The popular stories of the Hellfire Club, a name that was more of a nickname than an official title, are filled with lurid accounts of mock rituals, pagan-themed parties, and profound transgression. A speculative reading, fueled by centuries of gossip, holds that these caves were the site of satanic rites and debauchery. The limits of this speculation, however, are significant. Much of the lore comes from Dashwood's political enemies, and from later accounts that are difficult to verify. The stories may tell us more about 18th century anxieties and the power of rumour than about the actual events, so we return to the concrete object. A series of chambers dug into a hill. The Hellfire Caves force us to expand our understanding of a documented purpose. An underground space can be intentionally created not for work, but for performance. Not to sustain a community, but to separate an elite from it. The mystery here is not archaeological but social. It is a reminder that sometimes the underground is not where things are forgotten, but where they are deliberately and privately enacted. This kind of personal theatrical secrecy provides a sharp contrast to the secrecy of the modern state, which builds its own worlds underground for entirely different reasons. The theatrical secrecy of a place like the Hellfire Caves, created for the private use of an 18th century elite, raises one set of questions. But the ground beneath Britain holds another category of hidden space, one defined not by social performance, but by the quiet, administrative needs of the state itself. We can see this category most clearly at the coast of Kent, within the White Cliffs of Dover. The cliffs are a national symbol, a wall of bright chalk facing the continent. But inside this landmark there is a network of passages known today as the secret wartime tunnels. Unlike the chamber at Royston, these are not a mystery of origin. They are a documented example of how the state uses the underground for its own protection and administration, repurposing spaces as the nature of threat changes over time. The record, managed by English Heritage, shows the tunnels have a layered history. The oldest significant military use dates to the Napoleonic Wars. Tunnels were dug into the chalk to serve as barracks, housing thousands of soldiers tasked with defending Britain from a potential invasion. The underground here was not a place of ritual or industry, but of shelter and readiness, a vast subterranean garrison. A century and a half later, during the Second World War, these same tunnels were expanded and adapted for a new conflict. They became a critical command centre. It was from these rooms, deep inside the chalk, that Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay organised Operation Dynamo, the evacuation of Allied soldiers from Dunkirk. The passages also housed a fully equipped underground hospital, with operating theatres and wards shielded from aerial bombardment. Here, secrecy was a matter of operational security. The work was documented, but access was restricted. The final layer of use came with the Cold War. In the 1960s, as the threat shifted from conventional warfare to nuclear annihilation, a section of the tunnels was designated to become a regional seat of government. In the event of an attack, this space was intended to house the officials who would manage survival and recovery. This marks the beginning of modern secrecy, a form of concealment that is planned, budgeted, and officially sanctioned. It leaves behind a trail of documents, code names, and designated functions, even if those documents are classified for decades. The tunnels at Dover, then, are not an unexplained void. They are a case study in how a single underground location can be repurposed by the state across three distinct historical eras. They show us what a documented secret looks like. It is not an absolute silence, but a controlled and recorded form of privacy, where the purpose is clear, even if the doors are closed. This provides a crucial baseline. When we encounter a true documentary silence from an earlier period, we now have a clearer sense of what, exactly, is missing. From the coastal command centre at Dover, we move inland to the administrative heart of the state. Deep beneath the streets of Whitehall in London lies a suite of rooms, preserved exactly as they were left at the end of the Second World War. This is the Cabinet War Rooms, now managed by the Imperial War Museums. Here, the nature of the underground space changes again. This is not a site of ancient extraction, nor is it a place of debated ritual. It is a documented instrument of modern government. These corridors and offices were the subterranean headquarters for the British war effort, a nerve centre sealed from the city above. The contrast with a site like Royston Cave is absolute. At Royston, the carved walls are almost the only document that survives. The mystery is born from a profound documentary silence. Here, in the war rooms, the physical space is merely the container for an immense archive of evidence. We have floor plans, telephone logs, meeting minutes, and the direct testimony of the people who worked here. The secrecy was an operational requirement for a specific period, not an enduring historical enigma. It was a secret with a purpose, an end date, and a paper trail. This is what a modern, state-level secret tends to look like. It is bureaucratic, technological, and systematic. Its existence is hidden, but its function is meticulously recorded within the circles that need to know. The rooms were not created by a forgotten folk tradition or an unrecorded religious impulse. They were created by a government ministry to solve a strategic problem: how to protect the core functions of the state from aerial bombardment. By providing such a clear and documented example, the war rooms offer a vital measuring stick. They show us that when a modern state builds underground for secret purposes, it leaves a very particular kind of footprint in the historical record. The absence of such a footprint at older sites makes their silence all the more distinct. The question is not simply "0", but "1". The end of the Second World War did not, however, end the practice of building such spaces. It simply shifted the perceived threat. The model of a hardened, subterranean command centre proven in one global conflict would be expanded on an almost unimaginable scale for the next. The underground rooms beneath Whitehall show one form of modern secrecy: a compact nerve centre built for command during a conventional war. But the threat that followed the Second World War was of a different order of magnitude, and it demanded a different kind of underground space. The solution was not built from scratch in the heart of the city, but repurposed from an enormous industrial void already hidden in the countryside. The story begins in Wiltshire, beneath the hills around the town of Corsham. For centuries this area was the source of bathstone, and the quarrying left behind a sprawling network of tunnels and chambers. During the Second World War, this existing underground space was adapted for security. Part of it became a subterranean factory for aircraft engines, and another section was used as a vast ammunition depot. This was a pattern of practical reuse. But in the 1950s, a far more ambitious project began. The threat of nuclear attack required a site where the machinery of government could survive, isolated from a contaminated surface. The Corsham quarries were chosen for this purpose, under a series of code names, including Sublime, Hawthorne, and eventually Burlington. A section of the quarry was sealed off and transformed. This was not a simple set of offices. It was an underground town built to house up to 4,000 central government staff and support personnel for as long as 3 months. The scale of the conversion is difficult to overstate. The site covered more than 1 million square feet with nearly 60 miles of roadways. It was designed to be entirely self-sufficient. It had its own underground power station, its own water treatment plant that drew from a subterranean lake, and vast storage tanks for fuel. It contained a hospital, kitchens, a bakery, and a laundry service capable of handling 10,000 items a day. To manage the internal environment, it had an air filtration system and climate control. For communication with whatever remained of the outside world, there was a telephone exchange that would have been one of the largest in Britain at the time. Crucially, it also included a BBC studio, from which the Prime Minister could make post-attack broadcasts to the nation. The existence of this facility was an official secret for decades. While its construction and operation were something of an open secret in the local area, its true purpose and scale were not formally acknowledged by the government until 2004. Burlington represents a different kind of documentary silence than the one found at Royston Cave. This was not a silence born of lost records or the passage of 1,000 years. It was an active, managed secrecy, created by a modern state which eventually left behind blueprints, budgets, and declassification papers. It shows us that when a modern institution wants to hide something, the evidence of that hiding, the planning, the cost, the sheer logistical effort, creates its own distinct footprint in the historical record. The pattern of repurposing a quarry for state survival was not unique to Britain. For a brief, clarifying comparison, one can look across the Atlantic to a luxury resort hotel in the mountains of West Virginia. The Greenbrier has been a high society destination for centuries, but beneath one of its wings, a vast and secret complex was constructed. Its existence was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Cold War. This was not a shelter for the public, or a command centre for the military. It was built for the continuity of government itself. The bunker was designed to house all 535 members of the United States Congress in the event of a nuclear attack. Construction began under the cover of a hotel expansion project, with the lease agreement renewed in 1957. For decades, the facility was maintained in a constant state of readiness by a small group of government employees working under the cover of a shell company. Like the Burlington bunker at Corsham, the Greenbrier was a product of the same geopolitical fear. It was a space designed to allow an institution to survive when the surface world might not. And like its British counterparts, its secrecy was active and managed. It was a secret by design. But the most useful part of the comparison is what happened next. The secret was eventually exposed, declassified, and the bunker can now be visited. Its existence is documented. We know who built it, why they built it, and for whom. This is the character of a modern documented secret. It leaves a paper trail, budgets, code names, declassification records. It has a clear institutional author. Holding this category of evidence in mind, the planned, funded, and eventually recorded secret provides a crucial point of contrast. It helps to clarify what we are looking at when we turn back to the older, silent voids in the ground, the ones that have no surviving budget, no code name, and no declassification file. The absence of that modern footprint is not, by itself, proof of anything. But it does tell us we're dealing with a different kind of silence altogether. From the documented secrecy of the modern state, we can now return to the older, deeper silence of the past. But this time, we can return with a more precise set of questions. We have seen how records can be made, archived, and declassified. Now we must ask a more fundamental question. Why does the physical evidence, the tunnel, the shaft, the carved wall, survive at all when the documents so often do not? The answer begins not with people, but with the ground itself. The geology of Britain is not uniform. It is a mosaic of different rock types, and each one offers a different potential for creating and preserving underground space. The first and most important of these for our story is chalk. Think of the sites we have examined. Royston Cave is a room carved directly from a thick bed of chalk. The Neolithic mines at Grime's graves are shafts cut through chalk to reach the flint nodules within it. The Hellfire Caves were excavated from the chalk hills of West Wycombe, and the great wartime tunnels of Dover were burrowed into the most famous chalk landscape of all, the White Cliffs. Chalk is a form of limestone, soft enough to be worked with simple tools, antler picks in the Neolithic, iron shovels in the 18th century, but it is also stable. It can hold a vertical wall, a carved line, or the arch of a ceiling for centuries, even millennia. It is a forgiving medium. It allows human intention to be recorded directly into the substance of the land. The survival of these places is not an accident. It is a direct consequence of the material from which they were made. The chalk holds the memory. Now contrast this with the city of Nottingham. The more than 900 caves there exist for a different geological reason. They are carved into bunter sandstone. This rock is even softer than chalk, so soft that a person could carve out a cellar or a workshop with relative ease. This is why Nottingham has such an immense subterranean landscape. The low cost of entry, in terms of labour, was a powerful incentive for centuries of inhabitants. But this softness also makes the caves more vulnerable to collapse, to weathering, and to the pressures of the modern city built above. Their survival depends on constant management. The story is different again at Corsham, where the vast caverns that became the Burlington Bunker began as quarries. Here, workers were extracting bathstone, a type of oolitic limestone famous for its use in building. It is strong and durable. The empty spaces left behind were not fragile voids, but huge, stable galleries supported by pillars of unquarried stone, perfect for repurposing as a secure, hidden facility. Before a space can become a mystery, it must first be possible, and that possibility is written in the rock. The geology of a place is the first filter determining what can be dug, what will last, and what kind of physical trace a human endeavour might leave behind. The stone itself is the first archive. It preserves the shape of the work long after the reasons for the work have faded. Stone can survive for millennia. A cut mark in chalk or sandstone can hold its shape long after the institution that made it has turned to dust. But the survival of the material is not the same as the survival of the story. The physical object is only the first part of the equation. The second part is access, and access is fragile. For every underground space that is open, mapped, and understood, there are countless others that have been deliberately sealed. This act of sealing is rarely a conspiracy. More often, it is a simple, practical decision driven by safety and liability. A disused mine shaft, like one of the hundreds at Grime's graves, becomes a hazard to livestock and people. The most responsible action is to cap it or fill it in. A crumbling denehole threatens to cause subsidence in a farmer's field. It is backfilled with earth and forgotten. An old cellar beneath a building scheduled for demolition is packed with rubble to stabilise the ground for the new foundation. In each case, the act is rational, but the consequence is a physical erasure of access. The void may still exist, a bubble in the earth, but the entrance is gone. The story is sealed off. This process, repeated over centuries, is one of the primary mechanisms of loss. It is not an act of suppression, but an act of housekeeping. Then there is the slower, more patient mechanism of natural collapse. Water finds its way into chalk and sandstone. Frost expands in hidden cracks. The subtle pressures of the ground above shift and settle. A gallery roof gives way. A passage is blocked by a fall of rock and earth. The process is not malicious, it is geology. The underground space is not destroyed, but it is rendered impassable, fragmented. What was once a connected system becomes a series of isolated chambers, its original logic broken. Any attempt to re-enter centuries later would be met not with a door, but with a wall of debris that tells no stories. And in cities, there is the most relentless mechanism of all: redevelopment. Imagine the city of Nottingham, with its more than 900 known caves. For every new building constructed over the last 2 centuries, foundations had to be dug, piles had to be driven, utility trenches for water, gas and electricity had to be cut. Each of these actions is a kind of archaeological surgery, performed without an archaeologist present. A construction crew might break into an unknown cellar, document it briefly as a void to be filled with concrete, and move on. An old tannery pit is sealed. A domestic cave cellar is severed from its house and filled. This isn't a plot to hide history. It is the unavoidable consequence of a living city building its future on top of its past. Backfilling, collapse, and redevelopment. These are the physics of forgetting. They explain why so much documentary silence is not just an absence of paper, but an absence of access. The history is not necessarily gone. It is simply buried behind a later, more practical layer of earth, or stone, or concrete. The silence is the sound of a filled-in shaft. The processes of forgetting are often quiet and gradual. A passage is filled with rubble because it is safer that way. A shaft collapses, and the ground above is levelled for a field. A new building goes up, its foundations cutting through and sealing off the cellars of the one before it. These are not conspiracies. They are the simple, physical outcomes of time, convenience, and changing land use. But sometimes, that process runs in reverse, not with a grand announcement, but with the scrape of a machine against unexpected stone. In recent years, near Tintern in Wales, contractors were working on the ground, performing routine utility work. Their equipment uncovered something that was not on any modern map: a void. It was the opening to a stone-lined passage, a carefully constructed tunnel that had been buried and lost to surface memory. The discovery immediately created a story. News reports described a forgotten medieval tunnel, a phrase that sparks the imagination. It connects the find to a landscape already rich with history, home to the ruins of a famous Cistercian abbey. This is a natural and understandable first step. A new, strange object is given a preliminary label based on its location and appearance. But the discovery itself is only the first sentence of a new chapter. The work that follows is slower and less dramatic. Researchers begin the process of surveying the structure. They look at the tool marks on the stone, the method of construction, the geology of the trench it was cut into. They search for any associated artifacts that could help with dating. The headline offers a quick, satisfying answer. The careful work of archaeology is designed to find a responsible one. This is the gap where so many of our underground mysteries live, between the moment of physical rediscovery and the arrival of a settled explanation. The ground opens, and for a moment, anything seems possible. The tunnel is undeniably real. Its purpose, its age, and its story, however, must be excavated just as carefully as the soil that filled it. This process, this gap between finding and knowing, is the final tool needed for our own investigation. We began with a single, unresolved chamber at Royston. Since then, we have examined the known ground of prehistoric industry, the debated function of Iron Age passages, the practical logic of medieval engineering, and the documented secrecy of the modern state. We have looked at how folklore grows, and how the earth itself preserves or erases the things people build within it. Now, with this framework in place, we can return to where we started. We can descend the chalk steps of Royston Cave one last time, not just with a sense of mystery, but with a clearer set of questions. And so, with these mechanisms of discovery and loss in mind, we return to the chalk-walled room beneath the market cross at Royston. When we first descended into this space, it presented a single, sharp question. A room rich with physical evidence, yet almost completely silent in the historical record. Now, after examining other kinds of underground spaces, its particular mystery becomes clearer. We can now say with confidence what Royston Cave is not. It is not like Grime's graves, a site of large-scale prehistoric industry, its purpose made clear by geology and the tools left behind. It is not like the passages of Exeter, a clever work of medieval civic engineering, its function explained by the lead pipes it was built to serve, and it is not like the tunnels of Dover or the Churchill War Rooms, a modern documented secret whose purpose was hidden by design but preserved in archives. Royston Cave belongs to a different category. Its mystery is not one of engineering or state secrecy, but of meaning. The primary evidence remains what was found in 1742, a chamber whose walls are covered in carvings. The figures are recognisably medieval. There are saints, St. Catherine, St. Christopher, St. Lawrence. There are crosses and religious symbols. This much is direct physical evidence cut into the soft chalk. The cautious reading is that this was a space for Christian devotion. But this is where the record stops and interpretation begins. The popular theory, as we noted at the start, connects the cave to the Knights Templar. This is a speculative reading, and it is important to mark it as such. It is based on the interpretation of some symbols as being similar to those associated with the order, and on the cave's proximity to a former Templar holding. But similarity is not proof. Without a direct document, a dedication, or an unambiguous emblem, the connection remains an unresolved hypothesis. Historic England, the body that protects the site, notes that the inspiration is debated. The mystery, then, is not the lack of a story, but the lack of a verifiable one. The work of carving these walls was significant. It took time, effort, and belief. That such an effort would leave no clear author or purpose in the documents of a literate age is the central stubborn fact of the place. This leads to a more subtle question. Our modern view often separates spaces into clean categories: practical, industrial, religious, domestic. But what if the people who made this chamber did not see those lines so clearly? What if a space could be more than one thing at once? The question of purpose, for Royston Cave, or any space where the records are silent, often traps us in a set of modern categories. We ask, was it for storage, or for refuge, or for ritual? We assume the answer must be one thing. To test that assumption, it can be helpful to look at a documented comparison, not for a direct answer, but for a different way of asking the question. Thousands of miles away, in the cliffs and mesas of what is now Mesa Verde National Park in Colorado, the ancestral Puebloan people built their communities. Between roughly 850 and 1250 CE, they created a world of stone and earth, much of which is preserved. And central to many of their households and public areas is a specific kind of room, the kiva. A kiva is typically a round chamber, built underground or semi-subterranean. Originally entered from the roof by a ladder, its form is distinct, with features like a fire pit, a ventilator shaft, a small floor cavity called a sipapu, and a bench around the wall. For a long time, these were interpreted almost exclusively as male ceremonial spaces. But a more careful reading of the evidence, as presented by the United States National Park Service, suggests a more complex reality. The archaeological record indicates that kivas were centres of household life. They were places for routine work, for weaving, for making tools, for preparing food, for gathering on cold nights. Yet they were also, without contradiction, the setting for ceremonies and for spiritual instruction. The same physical room held both the ordinary and the sacred. This is the crucial point of contrast. Our investigation of a British fogou or souterrain often defaults to a search for a single, primary function. We weigh the evidence for storage against the evidence for refuge. The kiva, however, provides a well-documented historical case where this is a false choice. The practical and the ceremonial were not separated into different buildings, they happened in the same room. The architecture itself was designed to hold both meanings. This comparison is not an answer for the Iron Age sites of Britain. The culture of the ancestral Puebloans is entirely distinct from that of ancient Cornwall or Scotland. But the kiva offers a valuable mental tool. It is a real, historical example of an underground space that resists a singular label. It reminds us that the line between daily life and ritual might be a modern projection. A space can be intensely practical and deeply meaningful at the same time. If we carry this thought, not as a solution, but as a lens, back to the underground passages of Britain, the nature of the inquiry shifts. Perhaps the question is not which single purpose fits best. Perhaps the better question is how many different kinds of human need one stone-lined room could hold. The comparison to the kivas of Mesa Verde is not a direct explanation for Britain's underground passages. The cultures are entirely separate, but it serves as a useful reminder. A single space can hold multiple meanings at once. It can be a workshop and a sanctuary, a meeting place, and a connection to the cosmos. With that in mind, let's return to the Iron Age structures of Britain. We can look again at the massive stone slabs roofing the passages of Halliggye Fogou in Cornwall. We can revisit the low, stone-lined souterrains found beside farmsteads in eastern Scotland. The archaeological evidence presents a set of competing practical functions: a cool, dry place for storing food, a secure refuge in times of conflict, a safe place for valuables. Each of these theories is plausible, each accounts for some of the physical features, but none of them alone feels entirely sufficient for every example. The labour invested sometimes seems to exceed the proposed function. This is where the interpretive lens might need to change. Perhaps the problem lies in the modern desire to assign a single, primary purpose. What if these underground chambers were never just one thing? Consider a space built to store the grain that would see a family through a hard winter. This is a profoundly practical function. But for the people who depend on it, that grain is life itself. The place that protects it is not just a cellar. It is the heart of the household's survival. Its construction, its location, its entrance, all could take on symbolic weight. It could be a place of practical security that is also, in a meaningful way, sacred. Likewise, a passage that offers a final point of refuge is a practical defence. But it is also a place of extreme vulnerability and hope, a threshold between safety and danger. It is not difficult to imagine such a space accumulating stories, rituals, or special significance that go beyond its simple physical use. This model of mixed function does not erase the practical explanations, it integrates them. It suggests that the people of the Iron Age may not have drawn the same sharp lines that we do between the mundane and the meaningful. A souterrain could be a larder, a hiding place, and a symbolic anchor for the home all at once. Furthermore, the purpose of a structure is not always static. A souterrain built in the 2nd century BCE might have served primarily for storage. A century later, the descendants of the builders, living in a different social or political climate, might have used it more for defensive or ceremonial purposes. Over its long life, a single underground space could have been many things. This reading does not solve the mystery of the Fogou and souterrains by providing a single new answer. Instead, it suggests that the mystery arises from asking a question they were never built to answer. The search for a single label, storage, refuge, or ritual may be a modern habit. The more complex and perhaps more honest picture is of a space woven deeply into the practical and symbolic life of the household that built it. A space that could be all of these things, sometimes at the same time. The stone passages that remain are the silent evidence of that layered reality. With our categories sharpened, we can now return to a recurring feature of the British landscape, the story. It often begins with a physical place, an old public house with a cellar wall of dressed stone. In that wall is a blocked archway, or a field on the edge of a village where a shallow, circular depression marks the ground, a place local children are told to avoid. From these tangible starting points, a story unfolds. The archway, it is said, is the entrance to a tunnel that runs for miles to the ruins of a medieval abbey. The depression in the field is where invaders hid their treasure, or where smugglers vanished from the sight of the law. Earlier we encountered the engineering problems with these tales. The long-distance secret passage cut through unstable ground without ventilation shafts is often a physical impossibility. We saw at Exeter how a real, human-sized underground passage had a clear, documented and practical purpose, maintaining the city's water supply. Set against this, the folklore can seem like a simple error, a fiction to be corrected and set aside. But perhaps that is too quick. The story may be factually incorrect, but the act of telling it is a real historical event. It is a human response to an incomplete landscape. What if we treat the folklore not as a failed historical account, but as a kind of distorted memory? Consider the denehole. As the British Geological Survey explains, these were often medieval pits, dug to extract chalk for improving the soil. This was a vital but mundane agricultural process. Over centuries, farming methods changed. The purpose of the pits was forgotten, but the shafts remained. Dangerous, unexplained voids in the landscape. The story of a secret tunnel, or a hiding place for Danish invaders, is more memorable than the history of agricultural marling. The legend is a more durable explanation because it is more dramatic. This suggests an interpretation. A story like the monk's tunnel may not preserve the truth of a passage, but it preserves the memory that a particular place was considered important. It affixes a sense of significance to a location where the original context has been lost. The legend acts like a marker, a tag placed upon a landscape feature, signalling to future generations that something about this place is unresolved. It is an attempt to fill a silence. The story is not the history of the tunnel, but the history of the question the tunnel provoked. This reading does not make the folklore true. The smuggler's cave is still upon inspection, a short, abandoned chalk working. The monk's tunnel is still a medieval drain. But the story itself becomes a piece of evidence of a different kind. It is evidence of how communities try to make sense of the physical world when the instruction manual has been lost. The legend is what remains when forgotten labour or a collapsed vault leaves behind a question mark carved into the earth. These stories, however flawed, are attempts to remember human action. They are drawn to the tool marks on the stone and the darkness of the void, because they recognise instinctively that a person was once here. But what happens when the evidence we find is not just of an action, but of the people themselves? This shifts the nature of our inquiry and our responsibility. The stories that grow around underground spaces are often an attempt to fill a human silence. They are a record of our own curiosity. But sometimes, the silence that greets an investigator is not an absence of story, but the presence of people who can no longer speak for themselves. This changes the nature of the inquiry. It introduces a question not of engineering or purpose, but of responsibility. For a moment, let's step away from Britain to a different landscape with a different kind of depth. In the state of Kentucky, in the United States, lies Mammoth Cave. It is the world's longest known cave system, a vast network of passages carved by water through limestone. For thousands of years before European arrival, this underground world was explored by indigenous peoples. The evidence of their journeys is still there, preserved in the stable, dark environment. Archaeologists have found the remnants of cane torches, discarded sandals, and evidence of mineral extraction deep within the cave. This is a physical record of remarkable skill and endurance, but the record also includes something else: human remains, and the presence of burials fundamentally alters the investigation. An archaeological site is no longer just a puzzle to be solved for our own satisfaction. It becomes a place of memory and respect. This is where curiosity must learn to walk beside ethics. The work of institutions like the United States National Park Service in places like Mammoth Cave now involves careful consultation with descendant communities. The questions are no longer simply, what can we learn from this? But also, what are our obligations to the people who came before? The remains are not artifacts, they are ancestors. This principle is not a detour from our investigation, it is central to it. It offers a way to look back at every site we have considered, from the Neolithic miners at Grime's graves to the unknown hands that carved the walls of Royston Cave. Before they became mysteries, these were places of work, of belief, of life and of death, for people whose names are lost but whose presence is not. The ground preserves their labour, and with it, a quiet but persistent human claim. The discussion of Mammoth Cave brings a necessary point into focus. An underground space is not just a void or a puzzle, it is a record of human presence. And to look at these places without considering the people who made them, worked in them, and lived in them is to miss the central reason they exist at all. Once we set aside the more theatrical legends, what remains is a history of labour. Let's return to the chalk fields of Norfolk. At Grime's graves, the evidence of human activity is direct, physical, and thousands of years old. The people are the Neolithic miners. Their presence is felt in the discarded antler picks, worn down from striking chalk. It survives in the faint traces of soot left on the passage ceilings by their simple lamps. It is measured in the sheer scale of the operation, more than 430 shafts, dug by a community working together for a shared resource. Before this landscape was an archaeological wonder, it was a workplace. The mystery is not supernatural. It is the quiet fact of organised, difficult and persistent human effort around 2650 BCE. Move forward thousands of years to the 13th century beneath the city of Exeter. The vaulted passages there were not for secrets, but for service. The people here were civic engineers, masons and plumbers. They were the crews who laid the lead pipes and the maintenance workers who later walked these same tunnels, carrying lanterns, looking for the source of a leak that was disrupting life in the city above. The human story of Exeter is one of foresight and upkeep. The passages were built wide enough for a person because a person was always part of the plan. In Nottingham, the soft sandstone holds a different kind of human record. The more than 900 caves were not one project, but an accumulation of countless individual efforts over centuries. People carved out cellars for storage, workshops for industry, and in some cases simple dwellings. There is evidence of their use as tanneries, a trade that required water and was often pushed to the margins of society. Other caves were maltings for breweries or basements for inns. Here, the underground is not a single story of kings or commanders. It is a vertical archive of ordinary life and labour, of people making use of the ground beneath their feet to run a business, store their goods, or find a home. And even in the 20th century, in the most secretive state-run facilities, this pattern holds. The Churchill War Rooms were a centre of immense power, but they were operated by people. Secretaries and typists worked long shifts in windowless offices. Telephone operators connected calls under constant pressure. Clerks and military aides moved through these corridors, managing the flow of information that defined the war effort. The evidence of their presence is in the preserved desks, the specialised map rooms, the dormitories where they slept between shifts. It was an underground office staffed by people doing jobs that were, in their component parts, entirely normal, just relocated by extreme circumstance. From the Neolithic miner to the medieval plumber to the wartime secretary, the purpose that drove people underground was often work. The spaces they left behind, whether for extracting flint, maintaining water pipes, or managing a crisis, preserve the shape of that human activity long after the individuals themselves are gone. After moving through so many different kinds of underground space, from the workplace to the war room, from the water conduit to the ritual passage, it becomes clear that not all historical silence means the same thing. The questions we can ask of each site are shaped by the quality of the evidence they have left behind. If we were to arrange all these places not by age or location, but by what we can responsibly claim about them, a clear structure appears. First, there are the documented spaces. These are places like the Exeter underground passages or the Churchill War Rooms. Their physical form aligns with a clear surviving record. Exeter's vaulted tunnels were built in the 13th century to protect lead water pipes. The war rooms were a subterranean headquarters in the Second World War. The core mystery here is not what they were for, but how such practical infrastructure can fade from public memory and later become the subject of legend. The evidence provides a firm anchor, a baseline for what a known purpose looks like in the historical record. Next is a category of the widely accepted. Here, a site like Grime's graves belongs. While we lack documents from 2650 BCE, the overwhelming physical evidence, the more than 430 shafts, the radiating galleries, the discarded antler picks, the seams of floorstone flint, all point to a single coherent activity: industrial-scale mining. The purpose is not in serious archaeological dispute. The remaining questions are social and cultural, about the community that organised such labour, but the fundamental function is understood. This is knowledge built from the ground up, from material fact. Then we arrive at the heart of our inquiry, the genuinely debated sites. This is the proper category for Royston Cave, and for the Fogou and souterrains of Cornwall and Scotland. Here, the physical object is undeniably present, but its original purpose remains unsettled among competing, reasonable interpretations. The carvings in Royston are medieval, but their specific meaning and the identity of their makers are not confirmed by any surviving text. A fogou was clearly a significant, well-built feature of an Iron Age settlement, but whether its primary role was storage, refuge, or ritual is a question that the stones alone have not yet answered. This is where documentary silence is most profound, and where the demand for patience is greatest. Finally, there is the category of folklore. This is where the legend of the long-distance secret monk tunnel finds its place. Unlike the other categories, this one does not begin with a large unexplained structure that demands a story. It often begins with a story that has attached itself to a much smaller or more mundane feature: a cellar, a drain, a short passage for maintenance. The story preserves a sense of curiosity about the past, a memory that something is there, but the scale of the narrative consistently outstrips the scale of the physical evidence. Sorting these categories is not an act of dismissal, it is an act of clarification. It allows the genuinely debated mysteries to stand out, and it allows us to see what pattern remains when the unsupported claims are set aside. After sorting the evidence, after placing each site into its proper category, documented, debated, folklore, or genuinely unresolved, a picture finally begins to emerge. It starts with the objects themselves. A 9-metre shaft cut through Norfolk chalk to reach a seam of black flint. A vaulted stone passage in Devon, built just wide enough for a person to repair a lead pipe. A network of more than 900 sandstone rooms and cellars carved beneath the streets of Nottingham. A command centre, sealed inside the white cliffs of Dover, its maps and telephones still in place. When placed side by side, these spaces do not form a single, coherent map. The evidence does not point to one continuous hidden network, built by a single culture for a single, secret purpose. The idea of a lost, unified underground Britain is a powerful story, but it is not the story the material itself tells. Instead, what emerges from the ground is something subtler and perhaps more resonant. It is a history of repeated human impulses, a series of fundamental needs and desires that, again and again across thousands of years, led different people in different places to the same solution: to go underground. The first impulse is work, the need to extract something valuable from the earth. We see it in the organised, difficult labour of the Neolithic miners at Grime's graves, seeking flint. We see it in the medieval chalk pits, the deneholes, dug to fertilise the fields above. This is the underground as a resource. The second is the need for water, the simple, non-negotiable requirement of any town or city. We see it in the elegant, practical engineering of Exeter's underground passages, a system designed not for escape, but for maintenance. This is the underground as civic infrastructure. The third is the search for shelter and survival, the need for a safe place when the world above becomes too dangerous. We see it in the anecdotal accounts of people taking refuge in the chalk corridors of Chislehurst during the Second World War, and we see it, on an immense scale, in the quiet, declassified spaces like the Corsham bunker, entire alternate worlds built in anticipation of a catastrophe that, thankfully, never arrived. The fourth is the function of secrecy, the need for the state to protect its authority and conduct its operations away from view. We see this clearly in the documented wartime tunnels at Dover and in the preserved offices of the Churchill War Rooms. This is the underground as an instrument of power and defence, a world whose privacy is a matter of policy, not ancient mystery. Work, water, shelter, secrecy. These four drivers explain a vast portion of Britain's subterranean landscape. They are practical, understandable, and well evidenced, but they do not explain everything. There remains a fifth category, the impulse to create a space that is separate from the ordinary world for reasons that are not purely utilitarian. A space for devotion, for ritual, for social performance, or for a purpose that the stone remembers but no surviving document explains. This is the most difficult category to name with certainty, because it is the one where the material evidence most often outlives its original meaning. It is the category that holds the Fogou, the souterrains, and the Hellfire Caves. And it is the category that holds the chamber that began this entire inquiry. And so, we return to the chalk. Beneath the market cross in Royston, the chamber waits. The air is still and cool. The carved figures that line its walls have not changed since they were rediscovered in 1742. St. Catherine with her wheel, St. Christopher carrying the Christ child, the crucifixion scene. They are all still there, etched into the soft white stone. The chamber is the same physical object, but after our journey, the way one might see it has been altered. When we first descended that narrow shaft, the space felt defined by what was missing: its name, its purpose, its story. The documentary silence was absolute. Now, that silence has a texture. It can be compared to other kinds of underground records. We have stood, in our investigation, at the bottom of a Neolithic flint mine at Grime's Graves. We saw shafts and radiating galleries, the result of immense, organised labour. But that labour had a clear material goal: to extract a vital resource. The work at Royston was also one of labour, but it was the labour of inscription, of creating meaning, not of extraction. The value was in the images themselves. We have also walked through the vaulted passages of Exeter. There, a human-sized tunnel had a documented civic purpose. It was a maintenance conduit for lead pipes, a brilliant piece of medieval engineering designed for the practical problem of keeping a city supplied with clean water. Royston Cave offers no such utility. It leads nowhere. It transports nothing. It is a destination in itself. It is not infrastructure. And we have seen the documented secrecy of the modern state. The Dover tunnels, repurposed for the Second World War. The Churchill War Rooms, preserved under Whitehall. The vast Burlington bunker at Corsham, a government designed to outlive apocalypse. These places were deliberately hidden, but their secrecy was administrative. It produced archives, code names, operational plans, and eventually declassification papers. The silence around Royston Cave is different. It is not the silence of a redacted file, but of a missing page, or perhaps a book that was never intended for a public library at all. This comparative framework allows us to approach the most popular theory, that of the Knights Templar, with a more precise method. We can use the evidence ladder we have been building. The first rung is what is directly evidenced: a circular chamber cut from chalk, decorated with medieval Christian iconography. That is a fact. The next rung is a cautious reading. The style and subjects of the carvings place them in a familiar world of medieval devotion. It was likely a private chapel, a hermitage, or a secret meeting place for a guild or fraternity with religious commitments. This is a well-supported interpretation. The next rung is where things become unresolved. No surviving document from the period directly connects any specific group, including the Templars, to the construction or use of this specific cave. This is the gap, the documentary silence. Only now, on the highest rung, can we place the speculative reading. The theory suggests that the Knights Templar, after their suppression in the early 14th century, used the cave as a secret place of worship. The evidence for this is circumstantial. The Templars held the manor at Royston, and some of the carvings resemble symbols used by the order. This is a compelling story, and it is not impossible, but its limits are clear. The symbols were not exclusive to the Templars, and similarity is not proof of authorship. Without a direct link, a document, an inscription, an artifact with unambiguous provenance, the theory remains a speculation. A fascinating one, but a speculation nonetheless. And so we must return to the concrete object, to the chalk wall and the shallow grooves of the carvings. Seeing the cave now, after seeing the mines, the conduits, and the bunkers, does not solve its mystery. It clarifies the nature of the mystery itself. The power of Royston Cave is not that it provides a secret answer. Its power is that it preserves a question, intact, for centuries. It reminds us that some things survive not as neat narratives, but as the stubborn physical presence of a story's beginning, with the middle and the end left for us to pursue with discipline and with care. The room at Royston, then, does not become less interesting when we decline to fill its silence with certainty. It becomes the standard against which we measure other kinds of evidence. Its physical presence is a fact. Its carvings are medieval. Its purpose remains a question held in chalk beneath a market town. This condition, a surviving object without a surviving story, is not a failure of history. It is one of its most common and most instructive states. History is not a complete text that has been selectively hidden. It is an incomplete text damaged by time, indifference, and the simple, steady process of decay. Paper turns to dust. Wooden structures rot. Oral traditions change with each telling. The memory of why a particular shaft was dug for chalk, a practice that becomes obsolete, fades from a community. What often survives is the stone, the cut in the ground, the void that outlasts its purpose. The documentary silence around a Neolithic mine like Grime's graves is expected. It is the silence of an era before widespread written records. The work of the miners is the text. By contrast, the silence around Royston Cave is puzzling because it occurs within a literate period, a time of meticulous church and state records. And the secrecy of the Dover tunnels or the Churchill War Rooms is different again. It was a managed, modern secrecy that created its own archives, its own paper trail of requisitions, code names, and declassification schedules. Each silence has a different texture. The impulse to fill these gaps is a natural one. It is the same impulse that grows a local story about a drain into a legend of a secret passage, or transforms a forgotten chalk pit into an invader's hiding place. But the work of a careful investigation is not to fill the silence with the most dramatic story it can support. It is to learn to listen to the silence itself, to ask what kind of absence it is. Is it the absence of a record that never existed, or one that was lost, or one that's simply not yet found? The landscape of the past is not a map with certain areas blacked out. It is more like a terrain seen in twilight. The major forms are visible: the field of shafts at Grime's graves, the vaulted passages at Exeter, the carved walls at Royston. We can measure them, map their contours, and analyse the material from which they are made. But the finer details, the colours, the precise functions of every feature are not always recoverable. The honest response is not to invent what is missing, but to describe, with great care, what can still be seen. The value is not in possessing a final solved map. It is in learning a better way to see in the dim light. The journey through the ground beneath Britain ends where it began, on the surface. We stand on a paved street in Nottingham, aware of the sandstone cellars and workshops below. We walk through a field in Cornwall, conscious of the low, stone-lined passage of a fogou just under the soil. The world has not changed, but our sense of its depth has. The ground is no longer just a foundation for the present. It is a dense, layered archive of past work, past needs, and past questions. The goal of this inquiry was never to replace one mystery with another, or to offer a single secret key to every sealed door. The goal was to build a more careful way of looking. To begin with the object itself, the carved wall, the tool mark on chalk, the strange angle of a passage, and to ask honestly what it can support. To distinguish the solid evidence of a medieval water pipe from the faint echo of a folk tale. To accept that a structure can be physically real, archaeologically dated, and still hold its original purpose in reserve. This method is not about surrender. It is a form of discipline. It exchanges the fleeting satisfaction of a simple answer for the more durable understanding that the historical record is an incomplete text. This way of looking is also a form of attention. It is a quiet respect paid to the thousands of unnamed people whose labour is the primary text we have left. The Neolithic miners at Grime's graves, the Iron Age farmers of Cornwall and Scotland, the medieval engineers of Exeter, the wartime staff in the bunkers beneath Dover and London. Their hands cut the stone and dug the earth, their work survives, and in the absence of a complete written story, a careful and honest reading of that work is the most reliable memorial we can offer. The final map, then, is not of a hidden network, but of a recurring human pattern. The impulse to go underground for work and for water, for shelter and for survival, for secrecy, and for things that remain just outside our vocabulary. Some of these spaces are documented, some are debated, and some have outlived their own explanations entirely. They remind us that the past is not a settled landscape to be viewed from a distance. It is a twilight terrain, one that requires us to move slowly, and to be content with seeing what the light of evidence can actually reach. This brings the investigation to a close, but the inquiry itself remains open. Many of the most interesting historical questions are found not in archives, but in the landscape. I'm curious if there is a place in your own town or region, a strange earthwork on a hill, a sealed cellar with a local story, a field name that hints at something forgotten, that holds a similar texture of physical presence and an incomplete history.